I'm trying, and you're not. So until you do it, I'm the boss.
When there's a problem.
How much competition do you have? How many competitors do you have in this market?
We have I don't know this individual part, just because we make 200,000 parts, but I would say there's almost no product we make where there aren't other alternatives to buy the part.
But it could be one alternative, two alternatives, or 1,000 alternatives.
Not 1,000.
Not 1,000.
Some number of alternatives.
So it's not a
always
perfectly
selected originally in a competitive process when the airplane's designed, where we're selected because of our price, our technology, our delivery, our contract terms, whatever.
You know, I find this interesting because this term free market comes up very often, but I don't think people really understand what that means, because so often it's not a free market at all. It's a captive market. It's one where we're forced to choose between 2 to 3 people. Oftentimes in these processes, there is significant argument and there's significant evidence that there's collusion in these markets, that it's not a perfectly competitive market, because a perfectly competitive market requires a large amount of competitors. Today is my lucky day, because for ages, we're consistently told that single-payer healthcare is too expensive. We're told constantly, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for covering the insulin costs of everyday Americans? And I seem to have found part of my answer here today. Right now, Amazon can scan your face without your consent, all of our faces without our consent, and sell it to the government, all without our knowledge, correct?
Yes.
And, Mr. Chair, I'd like to seek unanimous consent on how Amazon actually met with ICE officials over a facial recognition system that could identify immigrants. I'd like to submit this to the congressional record.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. Ms. Garvey, in fact, it's not just Amazon that's doing this, right? It's Facebook, it's Microsoft, it's a very large amount of tech corporations, correct?
That's correct.
Do you think it's fair to say that Americans are essentially being spied on and surveilled on a massive scale without their consent or knowledge?
I would make a bit of a distinction between what Facebook and other companies are doing, but yielding to Ms. Bullum-Weenie for more specifics on this. I will say most of the law enforcement agency systems operate on DMV databases or mugshot databases, so information that has been collected by agencies rather than companies.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ferguson, one of the prime constitutional concerns about the non-consensual use of facial recognition technology is rooted or alluded to in the 14th Amendment, correct?
It's correct, it's one of them.
And right now, companies, governments, agencies can essentially steal or use your biometric data from you without your consent, and this is outrageous, right? Because this is America, and we have a right to privacy. Isn't that right, Ms. Koliani?
That's absolutely right.
Thank you so much. Ms. Bullum-Weenie, I heard your opening statement, and we saw that these algorithms are effective to different degrees. So are they most effective on women?
No.
Are they most effective on people of color?
Absolutely not.
Are they most effective on people of different gender expressions?
No, in fact, they exclude them.
So what demographic is it mostly effective on?
White men.
And who are the primary engineers and designers of these algorithms?
Definitely white men.
So we have a technology that was created and designed by one demographic that is only mostly effective on that one demographic, and they're trying to sell it and impose it on the entirety of the country.
So we have the pale-male data sets being used as something that's universal when that isn't actually the case when it comes to representing the full sepia of humanity.
And do you think that this could exacerbate the already egregious inequalities in our criminal justice system?
It already is.
Thank you very much. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
How so?
So right now, because you have the propensity for these systems to misidentify Black individuals or brown communities more often, and you also have confirmation bias, where if I have been said to be a criminal, that I am more targeted. So there's a case with Mr. Ba, an 18-year-old African-American man who was misidentified in Apple stores as a thief. And in fact, he was falsely arrested multiple times because of this kind of misidentification. And then if you have a case where we're thinking about putting, let's say, facial recognition technology on police body cams in a situation where you already have racial bias, that can be used to confirm, right, the presumption of guilt, even if that hasn't necessarily been proven, because you have these algorithms that we already have sufficient information showing fail more on communities of color.
It's already super legal, as we've seen, for me to be a pretty bad guy. So it's even easier for the President of the United States to be one, I would assume.
That's right.
Thank you very much. Let's play a lightning round game. I'm going to be the bad guy, which I'm sure half the room would agree with anyway. And I want to get away with as much bad things as possible, ideally to enrich myself and advance my interest, even if that means putting my interests ahead of the American people. I have enlisted all of you as my co-conspirators, so you're gonna help me legally get away with all of this. So, Mrs. Hobart Flynn, I want to run. If I want to run a campaign that is entirely funded by corporate political action committees, is there anything that legally prevents me from doing that?
No.
Okay, so there's nothing stopping me from being entirely funded by corporate PACs, say from the fossil fuel industry, the healthcare industry, big pharma. I'm entirely 100% lobbyist PAC funded. Okay, so let's say I'm a really, really bad guy, and let's say I have some skeletons in my closet that I need to cover up so that I can get elected. Mr. Smith, is it true that you wrote this article, this opinion piece for the Washington Post entitled, "These payments to women were unseemly, that doesn't mean they were illegal"?
Well, I can't see the piece, but I wrote a piece under that headline in the Post, so I assume that's right.
Okay, great. So, green light for hush money. I can do all sorts of terrible things. It's totally legal right now for me to pay people off. And that is considered speech. That money is considered speech. So I use my special interest dark money funded campaign to pay off folks that I need to pay off and get elected. So now I'm elected, now I'm in. I've got the power to draft, lobby, and shape the laws that govern the United States of America. Fabulous. Now, is there any hard limit that I have? Perhaps Mrs. Hobart Flynn, is there any hard limit that I have in terms of what legislation I'm allowed to touch? Are there any limits on the laws that I can write or influence, especially if I'm based on the special interest funds that I accepted to finance my campaign and get me elected in the first place?
There's no limit.
So there's none. So I can be totally funded by oil and gas. I can be totally funded by Big Pharma, come in, write Big Pharma laws, and there's no limits to that whatsoever.
That's right.
Okay, so awesome. Now, Mr. Mirabani, the last thing I want to do is get rich with as little work possible. That's really what I'm trying to do as the bad guy, right? So is there anything preventing me from holding stocks, say, in an oil or gas company, and then writing laws to deregulate that industry and cause, that could potentially cause the stock value to soar and accrue a lot of money in that time?
You could do that.
So I could do that. I could do that now with the way our current laws are set up. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, great. Is it possible that any elements of this story apply to our current government and our current public servants right now?
Yes.
Yes.
So we have a system that is fundamentally broken. We have these influences existing in this body, which means that these influences are here in this committee shaping the questions that are being asked of you all right now. Would you say that that's correct,
Yes.
Mr. Mirabani or Mr. Schaub?
Yes.
All right, so one last thing, Mr. Schaub. in relation to congressional oversight that we have, the limits that are placed on me as a congresswoman, compared to the executive branch and compared to, say, the President of the United States, would you say that Congress has the same sort of standard of accountability? Is there more teeth in that regulation in Congress on the president, or would you say it's about even, or more so on the federal?
In terms of laws that apply to the president, yeah, there's just almost no laws at all that apply to the president.
So I'm being held, and every person in this body is being held to a higher ethical standard than the President of the United States.
That's right, because there are some ethics committee rules that apply to you.
And it's already super legal, as we've seen, for me to be a pretty bad guy. So it's even easier for the President of the United States to be one, I would assume.
That's right.
Thank you very much. It seems as though white men invoking white supremacy and engaging in mass shootings are almost immune from being labeled domestic terrorists in their violence. Mr. Ricci, the San Bernardino attack was labeled, the San Bernardino attack of December 2nd, 2015, was labeled as a domestic terrorist incident. Is that correct?
I believe so.
Mr. Austin, do you know the June 12th, 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting was also labeled as a domestic terrorist incident, correct?
That's my understanding.
Mr. Salim, when Dylan Roof, a 21-year-old white supremacist, entered the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church and murdered 9 African-American worshipers, was that labeled as an incidence of domestic terrorism?
I don't believe it was, but there's no question that it was.
So it was, in your belief as a leader in this space, it was an incidence of domestic terrorism, but it was not labeled as such.
That's correct.
Was the white supremacist shooting at Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue labeled as a domestic terrorist incident?
I'm not aware that it was, although then Attorney General Sessions came out and called it that, but the charges that have been brought to bear and are currently playing out in court are not ones of terrorism.
So despite all of that rhetoric that we were hearing, they weren't actually labeled, these white supremacist incidents were not labeled as domestic terrorist incidents. And I really dug into some of these distinctions. What was labeled as domestic terrorism? What was labeled as a hate crime? And I could not help but, as much as I tried to dig in and explain, I could not help but feel and see that attacks committed by Muslim Americans were almost automatically labeled as domestic terrorist incidents, yet white supremacist shooting after shooting after shooting is not. And I can't help but come to the conclusion that these labels, what's being labeled as terrorism, is almost exclusively coming down to the identity. And it seems as though white men invoking white supremacy and engaging in mass shootings are almost immune from being labeled domestic terrorists in their violence. Do you find similar patterns, Mr. Salim?
I think when we look at, and I'll just call it what it is, the terrorism that has been perpetrated against not just Jewish communities, but against Muslim communities, against Christian communities in Charleston, against Sikh communities in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and a range of other communities that organize based on race, national origin, ethnicity, color, etc. Like these acts that take lives, I don't know how you can label these actions in the eyes of the victims or the families or the communities that are affected anything other than acts of terrorism.
Thank you very much. So the list price is almost $2,000 in the United States. Why is it $8 in Australia? Mr. O'Day, you're the CEO of Gilead. Is it true that Gilead made $3 billion in profits from the sales of Truvada in 2018?
$3 billion in revenue.
Oh, yes, in revenue, thank you. And very quickly, the current list price is $2,000 a month in the United States, correct?
The current list price is $1,780 in the United States, and just to correct, the $3 billion was a global figure.
Okay,
for Truvada for PrEP.
So the list price is almost $2,000 in the United States. Why is it $8 in Australia?
Truvada still has patent protection in the United States, and in the rest of the world it is generic.
Dr. Grant, Truvada for PrEP is the only known drug that can prevent the transmission of HIV, correct?
It's the only medication that's been approved by the FDA. It's also known that tenofovir alone is prophylactic for HIV.
Thank you. And Dr. Grant, it was your NIH-funded research on PrEP that built on the earlier research work patented by CDC researchers. Is that correct?
Yes. My clinical trial was informed by CDC research in two ways. One, the CDC demonstrated that the pre-exposure dose was added to the efficacy of PrEP.
Thank you, Dr. Grant. And I would also like to seek unanimous consent to submit this Yale School of Law study into the congressional record, which concludes that the CDC's patents for PrEP were both valid and enforceable against Gilead.
Ordered.
Thank you very much. Dr. Lord, thank you for your advocacy here today. Is it true that the public invested $50 million to develop PrEP?
That is correct.
Is it also true that Gilead relied on publicly funded trials to obtain FDA approval?
Yes, if you look at their supplementary new drug application, you'll see that every sponsor of Truvada as PrEP was a non-Gilead sponsor.
When folks can't access PrEP because it's so expensive and we spread, the HIV epidemic continues, that also comes at a public cost, right? So the public is paying, we paid to develop PrEP, we paid to finance the publicly funded trials to develop this drug, we also pay and foot the bill with patient assistance programs, and also we pay when the HIV epidemic gets spread as well.
And will be generically available in the United States as of September in 2020, based upon Gilead agreeing to support generic entries 1 year
So
early.
I think it's important that we notice here that we, the public, we, the people, developed this drug, we paid for this drug, we led and developed all of the ground. So the public is acting as early investor, putting tons of money in the development of drugs that then become privatized, and then they receive no return on the investment that they have made.
Right.
You're familiar with the study that shows that between 2010 and 2016, of every drug, all 210 drugs that were approved by the FDA were funded by the NIH or public money.
Would it be correct, Dr. Kesselheim, to characterize the NIH money that is being used in development and research as an early investment?
Yes.
So the public is acting as an early investor in the production of these drugs. Is the public receiving any sort of direct return on that investment from the highly profitable drugs that are developed from that research?
No, in most cases, there isn't. When those products are eventually handed off to a for-profit company, there aren't licensing deals that bring money back into the coffers of the NIH. That usually doesn't happen.
So the public is acting as early investor, putting tons of money in the development of drugs that then become privatized, and then they receive no return on the investment that they have made.
Right.
Dr. Anderson, I have a question. Since you study comparative insurance systems, are there models where the public does receive returns on investments in other insurance models across the world?
There are a few, but they're relatively uncommon.
Mm-hmm. And how does that tend to work?
So essentially, if the places at the UK or someplace like that have invested money in it, they will get some rate of return on those investments. But that, again, it's relatively uncommon.
Would it be fair to say that most of the foundational research is being done with public dollars, and that, this is just sort of common sense. If you know the people who go do their MD, PhDs and want to win Nobel Prizes, they tend to go to universities, not becoming general counsels or vice presidents at pharmaceutical companies. I mean, is that not your experience?
Yes, and I think that's happening more and more. It used to be the case that a lot of large pharmaceutical companies had really big research arms, but in recent years, a lot of those companies have divested from those research arms and instead are looking for the research that's coming out of the academic settings. You know, a lot of these scientists go to work every day, and their incentive is to try to cure disease and to make people better and to progress and to, you know, develop the progress of science. And, you know, they're not thinking about whether or not they can become a billionaire or whatever
Right.
because of that. That's the incentive.
I'm running because everyday Americans deserve to be represented by everyday Americans.
It's not a coincidence that when you look at Congress and you might see in a picture that it's primarily white and male and older, it's also wealthier. And that has so much to do with our campaign finance system.
He's going to tell me I'm small, that I'm young, that I'm inexperienced.
Alexandria Ocasio Cortez was working in restaurants. Cori Bush was a nurse. Paula Jean Swearingen is a coal miner's daughter. Amy Vilela was an executive, but she had worked her way up from poverty to that place. Each of them was the type of person who isn't supposed to run for office. And the only way it's possible for people like that to run for office and to open a space so that regular working people can have representation in our federal government is to run these types of grassroots campaigns.
If I was a rational person, I would have dropped out of this race a long time ago.
People are going to underestimate you. People are going to attack you on social media and in the press, and sometimes in person. So what you have to do is have a story about yourself and your reasons for running that is good enough and strong enough to inspire legions of people to get behind you, to really motivate groups of volunteers to knock on those doors, to make those phone calls, to have those conversations on doorsteps. It's not about left or right or Democrat versus Republican. It's about up and down. It's about the party establishment and people who have been in power for a long time versus communities who feel they don't have a voice and they do deserve one.
¿Y sentías segura en esos centros?
No.
Vinimos a Estados Unidos, donde yo esperaba construir una vida mejor y más segura para mi hija Marie. Lastimosamente, vi morir a mi niña, lenta y muy dolorosamente, unos meses antes de su segundo cumpleaños. Ella dejó de existir. Me duele revivir esta experiencia y recordar lo que yo sufrí. Pero estoy aquí porque el mundo debe saber lo que está sucediendo con tantos niños en las cárceles dentro de la detención de ICE. Mi hermosa niña se ha ido ahora, pero espero que su historia estimule al gobierno de los Estados Unidos a actuar para que niños no mueran por negligencia y maltrato que dan.
Gracias, señora Juárez, por venir aquí hoy con el valor de compartir su historia. Quiero empezar con una pregunta que es muy importante. Primeramente, la ley de los Estados Unidos requiere que los niños se mantengan en condiciones seguras y sanitarias. Usted y su hija bebé estaban aquí en estas condiciones. En la opinión de usted, ¿estas condiciones estaban seguras y sanitarias? ¿sí o no?
No.
No estaban segura ni sanitaria. Pero también quiero preguntarle una cosa más. ¿Ha visto con sus propios ojos una cultura de crueldad adentro de estas facilidades?
Cuando yo estuve en detención en las jaulas, nos dieron una entrevista telefónicamente con los oficiales de Inmigración ICE, en la cual a mí me hablaron sobre qué era lo que yo venía a hacer en el país, a qué y por qué. Yo le respondí que yo venía a sacar adelante a mi hija, pero ellos casi no nos dejaban hablar. Y él me dijo con estas palabras: tú sabes que este es un país de americanos, que mi presidente es Donald Trump y que te podemos quitar a tu hija y a ti te podemos encerrar en la cárcel. Y yo recuerdo que yo me puse a llorar porque me quedé sin palabras como para poder responderles. Eso para mí es maltrato.
¿Recuerda si en algún momento usted o cualquier otra mujer en el centro fueron llamadas por nombres groseros por los oficiales de la patrulla fronteriza?
Nombres groseros, no, pero sí palabras que a nosotros nos afectaban.
¿Y cuál palabras?
Como ustedes son inmigrantes, cosas así inofensivas. A mí no tanto, pero solo en la llamada me dijeron esas fuertes palabras en la cual me dejaron sin responderles y con el derecho y la oportunidad de responderles del por qué yo venía a este país.
¿Y sentía segura en esos centros?
No.
And Mr. Chair, I just think it's extremely important that this is noted, that this is not an issue. You know, there are debates about money and resources, that's for another day. But what is being pointed to here is a culture of cruelty. To have a CBP officer tell a migrant woman escaping unspeakable horrors in her home country and tell them this country is for Americans, and to threaten separating her from her daughter, to threaten a human rights violation is extraordinarily concerning and at a bare minimum grounds for serious investigation by this committee and other entities. Thank you.
And that's what we're doing, so thank you very much, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
I will be damned if the same politicians who refused to act then are going to try to come back today and say we need a middle of the road approach to save our lives. That is too much for me. So often, you know, when folks, particularly conservatives on both sides of the aisle, say, when they say that calling for a Green New Deal is, quote, too much or too extreme or too radical, no middle ground is right. Because I'm always curious, but I'm always curious when they say that, oh, it's too much. What do they actually mean by that? Is 100% clean and renewable energy too much? Is fighting for dignified jobs that pay people enough to live too much? Is proposing a solution on the scale of the climate crisis to solve it too much? No. But let me tell you what's too much for me. Here's what's too much for me. What's too much for me is politicians looking and allowing babies' blood to get poisoned in Flint. for corporate profits. That is what is too much for me. What's too much for me is coal barons coming up to Washington, D.C., demanding bailout after tax break after bailout for themselves, and then not even paying their own miners pensions and put their own miners health care. That is what is too much for me. That is too much for me. What is too much for me is the fact that ExxonMobil knew exactly that climate change was real and man-made as far back as 1970, and instead of being part of the solution, they paid millions of dollars to lobby and lie and confuse the American public about it, endangering generations to come. That is too much for me. What is too much for me is the fact that in 1989, the year that I was born, the year that many of us were born, and in years after and right before, that politicians were first informed by NASA, that Congress was first notified by NASA that climate change was going to threaten my life and everyone here's life to come, and they did nothing. That is too much for me. And I will be damned if the same politicians who refused to act then are going to try to come back today and say we need a middle of the road approach to save our lives. That is too much for me. Solution to save ourselves, and that's exactly what this is.
Is white supremacy not a global issue? We've seen white supremacist attacks that were clearly domestic terrorism. Experts, in fact, the acting AG, Jeff Sessions, even called some of these incidents domestic terrorism incidents. The Emmanuel AME Church shooting of Black Americans in Charleston and the Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh of Jewish people, those were only designated and charged as hate crimes, not domestic terrorist incidents.
You're not going to find an actual charge of domestic terrorism out there. If you look at Title 18, right? If you're looking for...
Well, it says here that, but at the San Bernardino shooting or the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, they were designated and charged as domestic terrorist incidents.
They were charged, I'd have to go back and look, they were charged likely with, if there was a connection to a foreign terrorist organization, it would likely fall under 18 U.S.C. 23 A or B.
So because the perpetrator was Muslim, doesn't it seem that because the perpetrator is Muslim,
that's not correct. That has nothing
that
to do,
the designation would
no.
say it's a foreign
No,
organization?
it's not correct. That is not correct.
Okay. Can you explain why?
So, homegrown violent extremists, most of the people we arrest in the United States, homegrown violent extremists, self-radicalized, born in the U.S., doesn't matter what religion.
But the Orlando Pulse Club shooter meets those qualifications, and you're implying...
He was worked as an international terrorist because he was following under the definition...
But he was homegrown and self-radicalized.
Extremist cases, how we work homegrown violent extremist cases, under the global jihad, we worked under international terrorism. That is correct.
Is white supremacy not a global issue?
It is a global issue.
So why are they not charged with foreign
because the United
terrorism?
States Congress doesn't have a statute for us for domestic terrorism like we do on a foreign terrorist organization like ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab.
Could you see how this could create issues and discrepancies with how violent extremism by Muslim perpetrators could potentially, even if it's unintentional, but that there are holes and there are gaps here, not through your fault or any one specific person's fault. It could be our fault as Congress. But could you see how one could see how the way that we are pursuing and charging white supremacy, particularly if they tend to be charged with hate crimes, and where that same type of violence committed by a Muslim extremist could be charged with domestic terrorism. Hate crimes and domestic terrorism are treated and charged, they're different crimes, and they could be pursued differently with different resource allocations. Can you see how people would say that these are being treated differently? This is a pattern about some people being subject to the rule of law and others not. I think that this taps into a deeper narrative and a deeper pattern of what is happening out of this administration, where they believe that the rule of law only belongs and applies to some people and not others. Right here and now, we're about 20 years away from the Central Park 5, where the president put out a full-page ad demanding the death penalty for 5 Black and brown boys. Boys, they were not yet 18 years old, demanding the death penalty for something they were accused of and innocent of. And here we have just documented evidence of multiple times of violation of the same law, and he won't even issue a slap on the wrist.
Let me know when the jail sentence starts.
This is a pattern about some people being subject to the rule of law and others not. And when that happens, there is no rule of law at all. At all. And that's why it's important that we make sure that everyone is held accountable, because whether it's a billionaire, whether it's an administration official, or whether it's a postal worker or a kid on the street, we all must be held accountable to the same extent by the rule of law. Thank you very much. I want to know about the racism and the very disturbing history that we're seeing here. That's what I want to know. The census is a constitutionally mandated operation that we are required to implement every 10 years. It is one of the most vital and sensitive things that we do in our government. Any change to the census, any addition of a question, usually takes 5 years of a process to make sure that it is vetted, that every word has been tested, to make sure that it is effective, because it is one of the most important things that we do. So it's not that this is not about whether or not I want to know who is a citizen in the United States or not. What I want to know is why this question was added, why 2 years have been shaved off of that 5-year process. I want to know why we have skipped every normal mandated procedure in testing how this question gets added in the census. I want to know why this question was magically added after we have seen that a political operative knew and detailed an intent to intimidate racial and immigrant communities for a partisan purpose, saying this will hurt Democrats and help Republicans. That's what I want to know. I want to know why Secretary Ross continued to meet with people of disturbing political affiliations after his own administration warned him to stop. He came right here and I asked him, did you continue speaking with him after this? He told me no, we had an email, and he did. He did. I want to know why people like Chris Kobach, with a documented history of overseeing effects. He has a resume of voter suppression techniques in the state of Kansas. I want to know why folks like that have their fingerprints all over the most sensitive census operations that we have as a United States government. This determines who is here. This determines who has power in the United States of America. That is what we want to know. I want to know about corruption. That's what I want to know about, the racism and the very disturbing history that we're seeing here. That's what I want to know. And so we gave the opportunity to ask. We asked, why are all of these things happening? Why is all of this connected? Why are there so many people, everyone from Steve Bannon to Chris Kobach, having their fingerprints and their political intent all over the United States Census? Why? And what did we get? Nothing. No response. Stonewalling, we're getting obstruction, we're getting a lack of answers. I don't want to issue a subpoena. Nobody wants to be in a position where you have to issue a subpoena of an administration official, because we are a co-equal branch of government, and it should be expected that when we ask a question, we get a response. But when we don't, we have to do our job. No one wants to be in a position where we have to issue a subpoena. But today, because of the Secretary and because of the Attorney General's refusal to cooperate with a co-equal branch of government, we have no choice. This is about the rule of law, this is about the respect of our institutions, and this is about the power of all of us as a body, as the United States Congress, and the integrity of the government of the United States. Thank you very much. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
In 2019, in an era where we think that where we have insulin for sale and we try to skim off the profits of life-saving medications, it is radical to believe that caring for our veterans should not be for sale in America. And here's the thing, they are trying to fix it. But who are they trying to fix it for, is the question we gotta ask. And this is who they're trying to fix it for. They're trying to fix the VA for pharmaceutical companies. They're trying to fix the VA for insurance corporations. And ultimately, they're trying to fix the VA for a for-profit healthcare industry that does not put people or veterans first. And so we have a responsibility to protect it. Because if it is any community that deserves Cadillac, first-class healthcare in the United States of America, it is our military service members and veterans. Period. People talk about the advocacy that comes from our district and the advocacy that comes from me as though it's this big, radical, scary, crazy thing. And you know why they say it's so radical and so crazy? You know, it's this big, radical belief at the core of what we advocate for is because we believe that some things should not be for sale in this country. That we have seen when it comes to privatization is the idea that this thing that isn't broken, this thing that provides some of the highest quality care to our veterans somehow needs to be fixed, optimized, tinkered with until we don't even recognize it anymore. And so when we talk about the VA, we need to talk about protecting the VA. And if we really want to fix the VA so badly, let's start hiring and filling up some of those 49,000 vacancies that haven't been hired.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border, and that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps. If that doesn't bother you, we can have, okay, whatever. I want to talk to the people that are concerned enough with humanity to say that we should not, that never again means something. And that the fact that concentration camps are now an institutionalized practice in the home of the free is extraordinarily disturbing.
Does she not owe every Jew on this planet an apology? Has she ever been to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, or Auschwitz-Birkenau in southern Poland, or Dachau in Germany? Never again is the phrase that Jews all over the world use to make sure that the extermination between 1939 and 1945 never happens again. And she's using concentration camps to describe what's happening on the southern border. How in the world is that acceptable?
You know, I don't use those words lightly. I don't use those words to just throw bombs. I use that word because that is what an administration that creates concentration camps is. A presidency that creates concentration camps is fascist. And it's very difficult to say that, because it is very difficult to accept the fact that that is how bad things have gotten. But that is how bad things have gotten.
In March alone, CBP apprehended and encountered over 103,000 migrants crossing without legal status, the most in 1 month for over a decade. Simply put, the system is full and we are well beyond our capacity. This means that the new waves of vulnerable populations arriving here and exacerbating the already urgent humanitarian security crisis at the border, we don't have room to hold them, we don't have the authority to remove them fairly and expeditiously, and they are not likely to be allowed to remain in the country at the end of their immigration proceedings.
I'm trying and you're not. So until you do it, I'm the boss. How about that?
You heard it here.
I went to go visit these people that were planning this civic action in a church, and they said, you know, this was right after the UN report came out that said we had 12 years left to address climate change, or our Earth will irrevocably change for the worse. And they said, we have to do something. I'm literally looking at people who are 14, 15 years old, and I'm not, you know, I'm 29, and I know that this is gonna be the world that we're gonna have to deal with, that we're gonna have to live in. And with all due respect to my colleagues, but especially in like the Republican Party, it's like, you're not gonna have to live with this problem. You're just, I'm sorry.
I.e., you're
Like-
too old.
I mean,
Be
no,
around.
but seriously, and it's not to create like an ageism issue, because there are people in older generations that have been fighting for the right thing for decades, since the 70s, and you know, they created the EPA and they've been fighting on these issues. But there are a lot of other people that are just like not dealing with it. And I'm looking at these people who are like 14, 15 years old in the eye, and they're like, help us. The power is in the person who's trying, regardless of the success. If you're trying, you've got all the power, you're driving the agenda, you're doing all this stuff. Like, I just introduced Green New Deal 2 weeks ago, and it's creating all of this conversation. Why? Because no one else has even tried. Because no one else has even tried. So people are like, oh, it's unrealistic, oh, it's vague, oh, it doesn't address this little minute thing. And I'm like, you try. You do it.
Right.
Because you're not. So until you do it, I'm the boss.
That's
How about that?
You heard it here.
And when it comes to shaping the national conversation, frankly, I think it's because there's so few people that are trying on a level where they are risking something of themselves. You know, there's that famous Teddy Roosevelt quote. It's the person in the arena. They said, "Man now is woman in the arena."
My favorite quote.
Yeah, and he
quote.
says, you know, it's not the critic who counts. It's not the person that's sitting in the audience that matters. It's the man in the arena. It's the woman in the arena. It's the person whose face is just smeared with dirt, who's just eating it, who's falling down, who's trying. That's the only person that matters. There's an exception for those drugs that have been shown medical promise, but we cannot prove that medical promise unless we fund the research. Madam Chair, I rise today to offer this critical bipartisan amendment that will allow United States researchers to study and examine the extraordinary promise shown by several Schedule I drugs that have been shown in treating critical diseases such as MDMA's success in veteran PTSD, psilocybin's promise in treatment-resistant depression, or ibogaine effectiveness in opioid and other drug addiction. Additionally, this will allow research into marijuana's impact in cancer relief, seizure treatment, and more. This amendment strikes a war on drugs provision that prohibits any activity, quote, promoting the legalization of any drug included in Schedule I of the Controlled Substance Act. The problem with this provision is that it is so vague and broadly interpreted that it prevents scientists from researching, examining, and exploring avenues of treatment that could alleviate an enormous amount of suffering from medical conditions.
I don't think this is what the government should be promoting, and I think we should have a lot more research before we tell our kids that this is what they should be doing, and I yield the balance.
My colleague across the aisle said, we need to research this more, and I agree, and that is why this amendment is being introduced, Madam Chair. The note was brought up that there is a rider provision saying that there is an exception for those drugs that have been shown medical promise, but we cannot prove that medical promise unless we fund the research to actually have it in the first place. So we have a catch-22, and we have to get rid of it. There are war on drugs provisions in so many federal statutes beyond just the one scheduling of these drugs. I'm a strong believer in evidence-based policy making, and wherever there is evidence of good, we have a moral obligation to pursue and explore the parameters of that good, even if it means challenging our past assumptions or admitting past wrongs. 30% of all military veterans have considered suicide. 30%. So if a substance shows promise in treating PTSD, we have an obligation to study it. One of the leading causes of death in America today is suicide. So if a Schedule I drug shows clinical promise in treating and in treatment-resistant depression, perhaps it is not the drug we should say is morally wrong, but perhaps it is the law, the schedule, the statute. Moreover, I'm proud to say that this is a bipartisan amendment. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle often bemoan the role of government and promote ideas of choice. And here I am happy in that spirit to agree, to say we should get government and political opinion out of scientific research when we have seen and showed promise in a way that can help people and their medical needs. And lastly, I understand that the politics of this bill may make it difficult for some to support right now. But I propose this amendment and urge my colleagues to support it because politics isn't always about winning today, but it is about fighting for what is right in the future and for future generations.
Do we live in a moral world that allows for billionaires? Is that a moral outcome in and of itself?
No, it's not. It's not. And it's not, and I think it's important to say that I don't think that necessarily means that all billionaires are immoral. It is not to say that someone like Bill Gates, for example, or Warren Buffett are immoral people. I do not believe that. But I believe
that he kicks his dog.
Right,
like
that. I'm not saying that. But I do think a system that allows billionaires to exist when there are parts of Alabama where people are still getting ringworm because they don't have access to public health is
wrong?
Well, first of all, I mean, the fact is ringworm isn't deadly. I mean, people get it's like foot fungus.
About these people who have ringworms in Alabama, I don't know if she's ever been to Alabama, but I don't believe she has a clue.
Yeah, well, I've been to Alabama. That's where everybody from my mother's side of the family is. And I've been to New York City, and we've actually got a bedbug epidemic in rich Manhattan where the liberals control that's much worse than any potential ringworm outbreak in Alabama.
I think that it's wrong that a vast majority of the country does not make a living wage. I think it's wrong that you can work 100 hours and not feed your kids. I think it's wrong that corporations like Walmart and Amazon can get paid. They can get paid by the government, essentially experience a wealth transfer from the public for paying people less than a minimum wage. Not only does it make economic sense, but it doesn't make moral sense, and it doesn't make societal sense. What kind of society do we want to live in? Are we comfortable with a society where someone can have a personal helipad while this city is experiencing the highest rates of people experiencing homelessness since the Great Depression? Should those two things coexist at the same time? Where do we draw the line in excess? And at what point do we return to this question that King asked, that Gandhi asked, that is our material technology outpacing our moral technology? We have to say at some point we need to start incentivizing investment in actual people, in working people, and the majority of people. And that maybe this idea of idealizing this outcome of maybe one day you too can be a billionaire and own more than millions of families combined is not an aspirational or good thing.
Justice is not a concept we read about in a book. Justice is about the water we drink. Justice is about the air we breathe. Justice is about how easy it is to vote. Justice is about how much ladies get paid. Hello, thank you, New York City! Thank you all. Are you all ready to make a ruckus? Are you all ready to fight for our rights? Are you all ready to say that in the United States of America, everyone is loved, everyone deserves justice, and everyone deserves equal protection and prosperity in our country? It is such an honor to be here, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we're gathering here today, the weekend before Martin Luther King Day. Because I believe that this moment and where we are right now is a resurgence from where the civil rights movement left off. And we are here to carry the torch forward, because when we talked about racial and economic justice, racial and social justice, we started to really extend those issues to the issues of economic justice, environmental justice, and the intersectionality and interconnectedness of all our fights. Justice is not a concept we read about in a book. Justice is about the water we drink. Justice is about the air we breathe. Justice is about how easy it is to vote. Justice is about how much ladies get paid. Justice is about if we can stay with our children after we have them for a just amount of time, mothers, fathers, and all parents. Justice is about making sure that being polite is not the same thing as being quiet. In fact, oftentimes the most righteous thing you can do is shake the table. Last year, we took the power to the polls. And this year, we're taking power to the policy, because we have taken back the House of Representatives. And that's just step one. This year we are going to organize. This year we're going to fight for voting rights. This year we're going to keep pushing because 2020 in 2018 we took the House of Representatives, and through 2020 we're going to take the White House and the Senate too. That's what we're going to do, because we need to advance and fight for an America where all people are welcome and no people are left behind. And I know that while this year has been historic, there's a lot more Congresswomen left here in this audience right now. There's a lot more city council women. There's a lot more workers that will be building businesses. There's a lot more. And I know that there's a future president out here too. Let us remember that a fight means no person left behind. So when people want to stop talking about the issues that Black women face, when people want to stop talking about the issues that trans women or immigrant women face, we got to ask them, why does that make you so uncomfortable? Because now, this is the time when we're going to address poverty. This is the time we're going to address Flint. This is the time we're going to talk about Baltimore and the Bronx and wildfires and Puerto Rico. Because this is not just about identity, this is about justice, and this is about the America that we are going to bring into this world. Thank you all very, very much. I'm so proud of you all.
Hello?
Hi.
Hey, how's it going? Hey, I'm well. How are you all?
Hello. It's fantastic to meet you. Would you like to introduce yourself in case some people don't know who you are?
Oh, of course, everyone. My name is Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. I am the Congresswoman for New York's 14th Congressional District.
Thank you so much
It's a pleasure to
joining
meet
us
you.
today.
It's a
Likewise.
pleasure to meet you.
It's a no-brainer. Trans rights are civil rights are human rights.
Woo! Thank you so much for saying that.
There was legislation that a Democrat was trying to propose that was essentially a protection for our immigrant community, and but it was a constitutional protection, I believe. And so we actually didn't co-sponsor it, and we actually pushed back on it, because introducing legislation that pretty much already reasserts what's in the Constitution makes it feel like it's up for debate. Like as if they
Well
voted
said.
if they voted if they voted down the law, it would almost make the constitutional guarantee seem less valid.
Yeah.
And so we actually pushed back against it, even though that it may seem kind of like a twisted logic or counterintuitive of sorts.
Well, once you put that stuff up for discussion, that's bad.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so really what I think we have to reassert is that when we say that equal rights for all, we mean equal rights for all, no asterisks, exceptions, fine print, nothing. And
This is so fantastic to hear, and I'm glad we got you on. I'd love to talk more about trans rights and the marginal tax rate, but I would also, I need to ask, do you know how to turn on the power in Frantic Factory in Donkey Kong 64? Because I've been here for hours and I don't know how to do it.
Do not. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Donkey Kong 64 is outside of my wheelhouse.
Well, that's
In
okay.
terms-
Your wheelhouse is really, really good.
I never owned an N64, though I do think it's probably the best system out of all of them. I never owned an N64, but I used to go to my cousin's house all the time. And she had Super Mario 64, Pokemon Snap, and probably a handful of other things.
Yes!
And that's probably all I know how to play.
Alexandria, you are giving a lot of people a lot of hope right now.
Thank you.
And I really don't have anything to ask, but I just wanted to say that. I'm kind of shaking right now.
Oh, no reason to shake.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, and I'm so happy that the movement isn't all just about one person either. It's that we can have these spontaneous, joyous, and supportive moments, and any one of us can be responsible and be the source of it. So thank you all so much, and have an amazing day.
You too.
Woo!
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I can feel all of my blood. I can feel it moving through the veins in my face.
Like every